This video has been requested by the patron Catalin Zima-Zegreanu. Thank you for the support and I hope you will enjoy it.
I dig my hole, you build a wall. I dig my hole, you build a wall. One day that wall is gonna fall. Gonna build that city on a hill. Gonna build that city on a hill. Someday those tears are gonna spill. So build that wall and build it strong, 'cause we'll be there before too long.
Bastion is an action RPG developed by Supergiant games. In this game you play as a nameless character only known as the Kid, who woke up in a world that has come to an end thanks to the calamity, and it's up to you now to reach the Bastion in the hopes of saving as many people as possible, all while listening to the narration of this charming, soothing voice.
Proper story is supposed to start at the beginning. Ain't so simple with this one. Now here's a kid whose whole world got all twisted, leaving him stranded on a rock in the sky.
It was released back in 2011 for Xbox 360 and PC. Since then the game was ported over multiple platforms. All versions on every platform are the same, so you can't go wrong with any choice there, but for all purposes of visibility, the footage for this review has been recorded on the Switch. My name is Stanislav Costiuc, I am a game designer, and this is my review of Bastion, which as always will be dissected with the help of my Stasocritic system, the first category of which is design. This is the most important part of Stasocritic with the biggest weight. 4. As gameplay is really what defines our enjoyment, and the way a game is built and structured influences that a whole lot. Bastion has an interesting set of core pillars. The first, of course, is combat. Skill-based combat specifically. Even though it features damage upgrades, Bastion is not a game about pumping up your numbers to big amounts. Rather, it's about being effective with the loadout that you chose. And that loadout is a big part of the next pillar, style, define and progression. Bastion focuses on giving you choices that would allow you to define how you would like to play, rather than simply making you gradually more powerful. And finally, contextual narration, probably the part which Bastion is best known for. This shouldn't be confused with choices affecting the plot, there is only a couple cases of that close to the end of the game. It's how your actions influence the narration, as opposed to the results of your actions influencing the plot, which is how most games handle narrative agency. In other words, most games would care about what you've done, but Bastion cares more about how you've done it. And let's talk about this part first, as it's quite fascinating. Broadly speaking, there are 3 types of narration you will encounter. The first one is the main storyline narration. It always has the same triggers in a level and does not depend on what you do. It's the lines that everyone will always hear.
And just like that, the Bastion comes alive. Starts growing again, growing stronger. Kid's gotta put its power to good use. Now the Bastion can send him even farther into the wild unknown.
The second type is player action narration, which is triggered by specific actions in specific locations. For example, close to the beginning of the game you can get to an area with a lot of breakable objects, and if you decide to keep smashing them, you will hear this.
Kid just rages for a while.
This line is relegated to this particular location. If you start smashing objects in another level, the narrator won't say anything, as the purpose of this particular line is to apply emotions the character would feel based on what the player is doing. The kid just woke up in a world that got destroyed and everyone he knew is dead. By being placed in this specific spot, the line contextualizes the action as the kid's emotional response to the apocalypse. It wouldn't work in any other location. Likewise, even though you can really go through the entire game by rolling because that's faster than walking, the narrator doesn't comment on that everywhere, but only in one specific action sequence where everything around is falling apart, because that's where mentioning rolling, should you do it, would enhance the experience of the overall situation.
Kid just keeps running. Somersaulting like crazy.
Another kind of player action narration is related to things like loadout choices.
A repeater goes with a hammer better than a box of nails.
Or even coming back to your old loadout after you received new weapons in a level.
Kid sticks to his old standbys.
The purpose of all these is to validate player input and make people feel rewarded for making particular choices that sometimes can be seen as gameplay quirks, but Bastion doesn't ignore them. The third type of voiceovers you will see is player performance narration, and it has two subtypes, location-specific and general. These types of lines essentially validate a player's skill, sometimes by commenting on how they got through a particularly tricky section. This would be the location-specific ones.
Know how many times Kid nearly fell off the bar back there? A good couple of times.
Other times it's the game validating some, generally speaking, skillful actions that wouldn't be tied to any specific place.
Wham! Kid's ready for the windbags this time.
Working together, all these three types of voiceovers create a narrative combination that is unique to each and every player, and that's empowering. Of course, it should be noted that narration in Bastion is not just an overarching story, but a set of different game mechanics. The condition for each voice line to be played are 1, for example. There are other rules that you can notice, like the game not repeating a single line of the narrator's monologue, unless of course you died and had to restart the level, but in that case Bastion doesn't save what has been said, and that's why you hear the lines again. If a line was already uttered, then the next time the narrator has one or more alternative lines for the same situation, and if there are none left, he just doesn't say anything at all. Each type of voiceover has a priority, with the main storyline narration overtaking everything else, and only one line can be played at a time to prevent voice overlapping. There also seem to be rules about a minimum time limit passing between different sections of the narrator's dialogue. That said, the game does feature design issues related to narrative placement, in that Bastion doesn't seem to always take in consideration the intensity of action sequences in comparison to the weight and importance of the narrative lines that are set to be played. There are challenge levels which tell the backstories of different characters, and there the narration sounds in between the waves, no which is encountered. You first listen to the story, then you fight a lot. But as you get closer to the end of the game, increasingly more often you encounter situations where the narrator talks about important plot information while you're participating in quite intense fights. And it can be very difficult to concentrate on what things he is saying that have absolutely no relation to what is going on screen. It's easy to comprehend what is being said when it is directly tied to your actions, like with the example of you rolling while trying to escape and the narrator remarking on your somersaulting. But it can be difficult to concentrate on the narrator discussing a character's emotional state and revealing important plot information while you're going through a gauntlet. Some people can, for sure, but oftentimes it can be too overwhelming because the player is trying to perform two widely different activities at once. And combat in Bastion does require concentration. It's fast-paced but deliberate, meaning that the actions don't take long to perform, but once you start doing them you have to commit. There is no real way to properly cancel anything out. And yet, everything feels incredibly responsive. As soon as you press the button, boom, the action is performed, with a ton of game feel effects accompanying what's happening on screen. When you hit with the hammer, there is a slight pause and attack animation to signify impact. When enemies hit you, the screen shakes. When enemies enter the part of their wind-up state when they will be countered if you block, they either have an animation shake or some visual effect coming out of them. Combat feels good. The only exception to this is the feedback for ranged weapon power shots. To know when to release the button to perform one, the kid flashes. The problem is that when you're targeting someone, your eyes focus more on the enemy in the targeting line rather than on the main character. Eventually you will learn the timings, but it's very tricky to do so when an effect that will help with that is just a little flash in the center of the screen when you're focusing on everything around the center. Every weapon is a valid choice for you to use. Some are better in certain situations than others, but there is really no absolutely overpowered weapon. Everything has their pros and cons. The sail hammer that you get at the beginning of the game is a bit on the slower side but very powerful. The war machete is the opposite, weaker but with very fast attack speed. Fire bellows has a continuous attack but you have to wait for it to recharge. The carbine is good for firing at single enemies, while the scrap musket is, well, a shotgun, perfect against groups of enemies at close range but loses its efficiency with distance. There are 11 weapons in Bastion and each feels unique. It's less about which weapon is more powerful and more about which one you like to use more. Even when close to the end of the game you get this huge calamity cannon, you might want to switch to something else after getting it simply because you prefer the fast-paced style of dueling guns, rather than a monstrosity that has to be charged up before firing and can also damage yourself if you're too close to the blast radius. Now, the weapon differentiation is just one layer of depth to the combat experience. The second layer is upgrades. Each weapon has a set of 10 potential improvements divided across 5 pairs, and from each purchased pair you can choose only one upgrade. Don't worry though, you don't have to stick with your decision forever, you can change at any time what that upgrade is in the forge. Do you want your scrap musket to do more damage, or do you want it to knock enemies farther away, so just push them off the abundant amount of edges in the game? Do you want that gun to reload faster, or do you want it to be more efficient at longer ranges? Do you want your machete to do massive critical damage while increasing the chances of critical hits happening, or would you prefer a more surefire approach of it dealing lasting damage over time? You can take only 2 different weapons with you at once, but the choice is not limited to a pair of melee and ranged weapons. It can be anything you want, and these loadout choices are augmented by 2 more mechanics. The first one is secret skills, which are special activated abilities that utilize a black tonic consumable. There are general ones that don't relate to your loadout, like for example calling upon an ally or snaring an enemy up, and also those that are specific to weapons you chose, like a whirlwind attack for your hammer. And all that can be customized even more through your choice of spirits in the distillery, special passive permanent upgrades. Your machete is said to have increased damage on critical hit, so maybe you would like a rare whiskey that makes absolutely every hit a guaranteed critical as long as you're at or beneath a 1/3 of your health. Or if you consider that to be too risky, maybe you prefer a smaller critical chance increase at the expense of some of your maximum health. But you can increase your survivability by applying a spirit that makes you regain life when you damage enemies at the expense of the efficiency of your healing elixirs. But then there's a spirit that increases the maximum amount of elixirs you can carry at a time. You can see now what I meant in the beginning by progression providing you choices for your playstyle rather than full power. You start the game only with a hammer, but end it with a massive array of combat tools to use. Bastion is so focused on combat that it technically has a pretty limited range of mechanics and variables, but they have a ton of depth to them, and you as a player have pretty much unlimited power to customize the experience to your preferences. Which includes the difficulty. As you get all these tons of upgrades, you might relish in the sense of power that you have. You also might yearn for something that will challenge you more. Bastion has solutions for such players. If you find the game difficulty lacking, you can always pump it up by invoking different idols in your Bastion's shrine. And like with weapons and their upgrades, the choice of difficulty is not just about the enemy's power, although there are gods that increase health and damage of your opponents, but about the breadth of the mechanics that they have. There's an idol that makes enemies drop little bombs upon death. This significantly changes how you play, especially in areas with a lot of weaker enemies. There is an idol that makes your character slow down if hit. There is an idol that makes all enemies at random turn translucent, with your attacks not making impact in that state. All these parameters don't just change their raw numbers, but the actual style and pace of combat. And with those activated, you might want to find new strategies with the loadouts and upgrades that you choose. Of course, regardless of the amount of customization options that you have, they're only as good as the enemies you fight against. And I have heard quite a lot of criticisms against Bastion's enemy variety, implying that there is not enough of it. But I only partially agree with that for several reasons. First, we have to make a distinction between the notions of mechanical variety and visual variety. Let's take this guy with a pickaxe. It's a gas fella. There is your standard gas fellas that take some time to attack. Then there's green gas fellas that attack with a charge. And then there's larger gas fellas whose attacks destroy the ground underneath, and if you're hit by them you fly off into the air and need to recover in time to land properly. Now, mechanically all those are different enemies that alter the pace of combat, and in case of the larger one, the arena itself, in varying ways. But visually they're all gas fellas. So there's quite a bit of actual mechanical variety, but it can feel like there's not because you're fighting enemies from the same family. Now, even then, someone might argue that around 2.5 dozen enemies that the game has is not enough for an action RPG. But Bastion is pretty short. If you decide to just run through the main storyline, it will take you about 3-4 hours to do so. If you would like to find everything you can and complete all the challenges, then that becomes 6-7 hours. Scope matters a lot, and for the game of Bastion's scope, it has more than enough enemies. Plus the idols that add new behavior, and all that combined with a massive player customization depth means that you're in for some extremely polished and tightly scoped combat-based gameplay. The levels themselves, outside of special open reality challenges that are even shorter, are all paced to be around 10 minutes long each, which is good considering that they don't have checkpoints in the middle of them, so failure or need to exit the game doesn't reset too much progress. I don't really have much to say about them, as all levels are a fairly straightforward collection of combat arenas or other types of action sequences. Their point is to provide different contexts for your battles rather than to be interesting by themselves. There is a level where you're in a constantly moving conveyor belt, a level that is simply about defending against a massive amount of enemies, one that has 4 pretty short paths to explore, one of which has the main goal, and so on. Speaking of exploration, you won't really have a lot of that in Bastion, besides some side paths protruding there and there. But that again is also not really the point. When you play Bastion, you will keep encountering a varying sequence of combat and action situations with different parameters you wouldn't have necessarily encountered before. And considering the game's focus on and around the core gameplay, that's all it really needs. Combine that with different possibilities for you to delve deeper into the mechanics of Bastion with New Game Plus, or improve your skills with Score Attack mode, if you're interested of course, or should you need it in No Sweat mode for people not wanting to be penalized for dying and have unlimited chances to complete a level, and Bastion has just a lot to propose to you as a player interested in the experience it provides, be it for one playthrough or multiple. All this is why, should you open up all the scores for design, I will assign a 10 to Bastion. For the type of game that it is, mainly a relatively short, insanely combat-focused action RPG where progression adds playstyle choices rather than stats, it is exemplary. There are some flaws there and there which I have mentioned throughout the video, but they really are negligible and don't take anything away from the experience. It's time to discuss context. This category has a weight of 1, and it's about things that enhance the experience rather than define it. This time through plot, motivation, characters, arcs, basically everything related to contextualizing the player's actions. Bastion tries to tackle a pretty difficult task, to say a lot with a few words. Being a game that focuses on narration coming through the voice of a single character who talks, well, quite a lot, considering how many of the actions he has to comment on, it will be necessary to keep the narrator as laconic as possible. The game actually has some incredibly powerful lore that focuses on colonization, racism, segregation, integration, genocide, and all that with a pinch of personal bias from the few survivors that you encounter in the game, and only one person who we actually hear most of the time. When you begin the game and learn about the calamity that has crumbled Ceylondia and the rest of the old world into a bunch of little floating pieces, it feels like a sad apocalyptic event that has affected a beautiful fantasy land. But as you progress through the story, you learn that this is a fantasy western, in which your ancestors came from beyond the sea, took the lands from their indigenous people, sent them to reservations while having them work to gather resources for the colonizers to create a lush, beautiful city that will be the center of trade for half of the world. What adds more ambiguity to everything is the fact that the narrator is actually Ceylondian. And as benevolent and wise as he might seem as a mentor, he is also biased in plenty of ways, so you can't always be sure whether you can trust the way he tells his stories or not. Here is the thing though, That's only the lore of the game. Besides some great moments near the end, the actual story will barely try to tackle anything related to all these themes. Your goal is to repair the Bastion by collecting all the different cores, powering it up, the Bastion itself being a floating fortress designed to protect people in the case of an apocalypse. Of course, if you don't take things at face value, it becomes immediately questionable why there is already a device created for dealing with the results of the calamity if that was supposed to be a total accident. Something that is of course important for the plot and development of some characters, but not important enough to be a distraction for the main point of the story, which would be to collect energy-making MacGuffins. A story that is told in an empowering way, but a pretty standard one nonetheless. And toothless. For all its lore that is clearly meant to mirror the history of our world, Bastion doesn't actually stand for anything. Maybe in the current political climate I'm more bothered by this than I would have been otherwise. So many personas and companies are afraid to say anything that would alienate the increasing amount of extreme communities full of vitriol and hatred. For crying out loud, we have come to a point where there are citizens defending Nazis and fascism, and that is considered to be an acceptable point of view by politicians and corporations. Not to mention that in the gaming space we have so many toxic players yelling "don't bring politics into our games" when they see any attempt to be progressive about the works of art we're making. So in this context, Bastion is sort of the perfect apolitical game, in a there's good and bad people on both sides kind of way. Ultimately, the game bears a message of hope, unity, which is commendable, but Bastion is set in the world where an imperialist society invades and takes over the lands of innocent people who are just living their normal lives, and even with that in mind, it can be seriously argued that the oppressed indigenous society of the Ura are the bad guys. I'm sure that's not the intention, but Bastion leaves everything open to interpretation to such a degree that I guarantee many of these interpretations are not going to be critical of a hostile colonizational takeover. So if you open up all the scores for context, I will assign an 8. The game is well written, provides context in a smart way, and has deep yet laconic lore that is fascinating to discover. And even though at the end there are moments that will try to tackle the deeper themes directly, due to lack of particular stance, Bastion also wholeheartedly accepts hurtful for the society projections should the player have them. Now let's move on to aesthetics. This is another category with a weight of 1, as it's again about something that enhances the experience rather than defines it, this time through visual style, music, sounds, etc. Now, obviously based on the footage you can see that the visual side of the game is done incredibly well, in a style that really defies explanation. This sort of a fantasy steampunk western. It's unique, memorable, and the way the ground forms under our feet not only fits the lore of the game about this broken and destroyed world, but also looks aesthetically interesting. All that being said, I'm the kind of person who is really bothered by stylistical inconsistencies that some may find unnoticeable. An example is pixel density in pixel art games. It is incredibly annoying when the user interface has a different size of a pixel than the game art itself. Some might see where I'm going with this in relation to Bastion. The main character differs stylistically from absolutely every other NPC and creature in the game, looking less like a drawing and more like a 3D model, which ostensibly he would be, and this just constantly sticks out. Of course, considering that it's the only case of such inconsistency, it's not going to affect the score or anything. Especially considering how everything else is implemented in such an amazing way. Not only the overall visuals. The voice talent of Logan Cunningham playing the narrator is absolutely fantastic. The actor voices the character in a gruff but smooth way that might not be to everyone's tastes, but certainly fits the aesthetics of the game.
Ought to be a core down one of these twisted streets. But which one? Up north is where the gas fella foreman used to live, tending to his flock.
And the Bastion music by Darren Korb is absolutely fascinating. It manages to capture the melancholy of a broken world while sounding like it's music for a western setting. I don't really know how to explain it better, it'll be best if you just listen to this. The start of the entire game to me though is Zia's theme.
I dig my hole, you build a wall. I dig my hole, you build a wall. One day that wall is gonna fall.
Not only is it beautiful and even catchy, but also in line with the complex lore of the game. All in all, this is why, should you open up all the scores for aesthetics, I will assign a 10. Bastion is just oozing with style that perfectly fits the setting of the game to boot.
Gonna build that city on a hill. Gonna build that city on a hill.
Now, let's discuss Cohesion.
Someday those tears are gonna spill.
This category has a weight of 2, and it's about how well all different aspects of a game are connected together to create a wholesome, holistic experience. Whenever Bastion is discussed, a topic that is always brought up is just how coherent of a game it is, where everything is perfectly connected together. And I do not agree. What is perfectly connected together is the gameplay and the contextual part that narrates the gameplay. That is undeniable, we have spent a lot of time talking about why it works. Another aspect that is perfectly connected together are the lore and the aesthetics of the game, again we have discussed it in the previous section. But this is the thing, there are aspects of a game that go incredibly well hand in hand separately in pairs, but they don't manage to create a greater whole together, even if we take it at the very broad strokes. Bastion is a game about rebuilding a broken world thematically, but gameplay-wise it's about destruction. If you see a person turn to stone due to the apocalypse, you can, well, smash them. Doing so will not even necessarily get a scornful commentary from the narrator.
Blondie always wanted his ashes scattered here.
And this is dissonance on a fundamental level that spreads its vines through the whole game. The narrator being surprised about how much you're rolling doesn't fix that. Doesn't make everything whole, it just validates your actions, which consistently go against the themes of the game that we have already discussed. The story mostly ignores. And in the single moment when it doesn't, and I'm not going to show the related footage since I put spoilers only when absolutely necessary and it's not for the statement, Bastion doesn't implement its big moral choice through the confines of its game mechanics, but by suddenly opening up a menu where you have to select one of 2 options that would activate one of 2 possible scripted events. So if you open up all the possible scores for Cohesion, I will assign a 6. Bastion feels like a game that thought about its mechanics first and then found a number of cool wrappers for it after, not like it was built from the ground up with a particular experience in mind. And even themes of the game aren't really related to gameplay, so I can't assign a 7 even on that basis. With all that said, time to discuss emotions. This is the most subjective category of Stasocritic with the second biggest weight, 3, as even though it is fully focused on personal feelings, at the end of the day these personal feelings matter a whole lot. I have played Bastion 4 times in total. Once when it was originally released on Windows, then I replayed it again on Steam, then I played the game once it was released on Switch, and then I played it again on Switch to record footage for this video. Each and every time it was an absolute blast to go through. Thanks to the depth that the combat system provides, I actually tried different things each time. For example, in this last playthrough I once tried to create a combination of scrap musket with army carbine, 2 ranged weapons, and it worked well. Also previously I never really cared enough about getting first place in all challenges, but this time I did. And it was great because some of these challenges require you to either think a bit out of the box or utilize the little mechanical quirks to get that best prize. I never had a playthrough with all 10 idols turned on. I would usually limit myself to several at most. But hey, maybe in a future playthrough I will try that too. I'm sure my journey with Bastion is not over. But even though it is perfectly paced pure fun, I think it will be clear why, should we open up all the scores for emotions, I will not assign a 10, but a 9. Ever since its release in 2011, Bastion would never actually grab my heartstrings, even though it has pretty much all the components needed to do so. But it is only when writing the script for this video did I finally understand why, as I had to put my feelings into words. Specifically, my feelings about Bastion's failure to make a statement. And it's not that a game is required to have a statement, but Bastion teases you so much that it will, but is too afraid to actually deliver. It's time to summarize everything. When all scores and their weights are taken into account, Bastion gets a final Stasocritic rating of 87. It's really a great game, and if it's your first time watching my videos, I will have you know that my system is specifically balanced in such a way as to avoid inflation of 90+ scores. And getting close to that is quite a feat. You really can't go wrong with Bastion. Not only would it be enjoyed by everyone who likes action and action RPGs, it is distinct enough from other games of these genres that it might even interest those who usually wouldn't be interested in such types of games. And while it is said that the game clearly houses squandered potential that could make it even greater as an experience, Bastion is undeniably a classic, and a fantastic debut from Supergiant Games that since then would keep on making more games of a very high quality. Bastion is worth your time and money for sure.